welcome to my book corner, and today we're taking a look at the horror Booktube tag. Thank you to Noah at In Between the Lines for tagging me in this. We're going to swing through all the questions. Disclaimer first of all, however, as I have said multiple times in the past, I am not a massive horror aficionado. I'm only really now getting into it a little bit, so don't expect any grand pearls of wisdom on this one. But that being said, the first question to answer is, and I kind of already have, when and how did you get into horror? And I never really have done. Not really. I first read horror in high school back in the 90s. Yes, I am that old. But other than that, I never really went near horror to read, at least. And in all honesty, I've not really engaged with it that much in other media like gaming or film. It's just not a genre I spend a great deal of time in. Now that being said, I do like horror when it works in tandem with another genre. Science fiction and fantasy in particular work really well with it at times, so there is some overlap there, but horror on its own, not so much. Question 2. What was the first horror book that you read? Probably point horror. Which one is debatable? Camp Fear, Cemetery. I think it was probably Babysitter by R.L. Stine, but I'm not 100% sure. In terms of getting back into reading more recently, the first book that I reviewed on the channel was The Troop by Nick Cutter, which is a horror title, which I have some thoughts on. We may get into that a little bit later on. But what can you expect from my channel in terms of horror? There's a few different things, especially throughout July. So we're obviously doing a themed month, Don't Die July, myself and Noah from In Between the Lines. My intention is to try and get 2 reviews out a week throughout the entirety of July. We'll see how we go with that. On top of that, we also have some other things planned. We have a podcast that will go live at the back end of the month talking about horror in general and the books we've read. Could be quite interesting if we read the same books, because we never agree on those, so that may end up being a bit of a spicy discussion. On top of that as well, we are both going to be streaming over on Twitch a number of different horror games, some separately, some co-op like The Quarry and The Last of the Dark Pictures anthology books, which, if you've been unlucky enough to watch us stream the Dark anthology games so far, you will know that I am the harbinger of death, doom and destruction for any character in those games. It does not go well. Finally as well, we have a special D&D one-shot planned for stream at the back end of this month, which I will be DMing, which will be horror themed as well. That will be on the RPGs Like to Party Twitch channel. All the links for all this will be in the description below as well if you want to check any of that out. So, question 4. Do you have any favourite themes or subgenres within horror? Not so much yet. I do like stuff that's inspired by mythology and folklore, just as a general rule in terms of reading anyway. And I do like a slow burn psychological sort of thriller effect in my books. So anything that has like that psychological bent, I'm going to enjoy quite a bit. Which does actually fetch me on to number 5 quite nicely, an underrated horror novel or author, and one that I've not seen a huge amount of, at least not as of yet, is a book I've just finished reading called Seed by Anaya Alborn, which is very much a paranormal, slow burn, psychological horror, which I really, really enjoyed. And I'm going to actually throw a second one in here as well, and that is The Deep by Nick Cutter. I know a lot of people prefer The Troop. I disagree quite strongly on this one. I think The Deep, again, is a very strong, focused, more psychological approach to horror than The Troop was. And for me personally, I think a lot of people go into it with an expectation of a certain book and a certain story to be told, and that's not the story it's telling, but it is very, very good. However, on the flip side, you have the overrated horror novel, and for me it is The Troop. I'm sorry. I thought it was a convoluted mess. It had great promise. It never really stood the landing for me and actually kind of put me off reading Cutter's stuff, and I had to be convinced to read The Deep. And unsurprisingly, just like me and Noah disagreed on The Troop, we disagree even more heavily on The Deep. So, number 7. Recommend 3 of your favourite horror novels. Now, I'm a bit too early on to really recommend anything that I really like. So, I've picked 3 novels that I've read relatively recently that I think would appeal to people who like different types of horror. The first one is by Carl John Lee, and it's Psychic Teenage Bloodbath. Now, full disclaimer, this is not a title that I would ever read again. It's not one for me personally, but it's incredibly well written. If you are a fan of what I believe is called splatterpunk, if you like gore, really visceral imagery and horror, then I think you'll enjoy this one. Not for me, but if that's what you're into, I think there's something for you to love here. If you're a fan of twisted fairy tales, however, T. Kingfisher's Nettle and Bone is a relatively quick read that came out, I think, last year, and is an interesting horror subversion on the typical fairy tale trope, especially around sort of fairy godmothers, and is a really interesting mix of world building and tension all the way through. And the final one, which sits into my preferred psychological sort of bent, is The Luminous Dead by Caitlin Starling. Now this, again, is a very slow burn book about isolation in a dangerous environment and how the brain can unravel and see things that may or may not be there. And I found it a really tense read when I read it earlier on this year. Now, all that being said, from what I've read so far, is the book that I'd recommend someone new to reading horror, and there actually is, and that is You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight, written by Kaylin Bayron. Now, this only came out at the back end of last month. This is very much plays with a lot of the slasher tropes that you get in slasher films. It's a really easy read. It's got some likeable characters, but it does have some twists, turns and subversions in there as well that you maybe won't see coming, and it's an especially easy read for someone who's just coming into the genre. And I think it was the first book I reviewed this month, and I really enjoyed it, so I don't think that's a bad starting point for anyone. Are there any book to film adaptations that you particularly loved or hated? So I went to see The Bogeyman earlier on this year, which I really enjoyed. I'm not a massive fan of horror films, but again, the slow build horror in there was especially good. Obviously, that is a take on the Stephen King novel. But on the flip side, although I've never read the books, the Dark Tower film that came out a few years ago was unbelievably dull and lacking in any form of atmosphere, and considering that the Dark Tower series of books does have a bit of a reputation, I know it's not pure horror in itself, but that is one of the most disappointing films I've seen in a long time, especially considering the cast that were involved. It just lacked so much personality. Don't go see it, you'll be bored. If a film was a colour, it'd be beige. How do you discover new horror books? So a lot of the stuff I've discovered I found through TikTok, which is always a bit of a mixed blessing or curse, depending on how lucky you've been. I've been quite lucky with the books I've picked up off TikTok so far. I know Noah has not done quite so well with ones that he's seen recommended. The other place as well is obviously Noah, because he throws books at me that are horror related at times. And finally as well, occasionally on Booktube and Goodreads with the recommended reads based on what I've read previously. I think that's where I found the seed. Could be wrong on that one. What was the last horror book you bought? So there's a couple of options here depending on what you class them as. You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight I got quite recently, as it's only just come out. But in the last couple of days I've picked up a book which you could argue is a horror or a thriller, and that's The Only One Left by Riley Sager. That's only just come out the last couple of days, so that is most definitely my most recent book purchase in general, so that's always nice. And what horror book is at the top of your wish list? And this is actually a really easy one. I have it on pre-order already, and it is Camp Damascus, written by Chuck Tingle. Now, Chuck Tingle is better known for a very different sort of novel, and this is what he's classing as his first serious novel that he's written, and it looks really interesting. It's a horror story based around a gay conversion camp, which, you know, straight away is a horror all of its own. But I've got that on pre-order. It probably won't quite get here in time to fall into July, but I'll be reviewing that in early August at the very latest. But yeah, that's my version of the horror booktube tag. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'll catch you all next time.